I'd like to welcome James Landay, who's flown all the way from Stanford to come and give this seminar, but he is going on to another conference, so it's a stopover. But it is a joint seminar between UCLIC, DeepMind, ELLIS CSML. So I'd like to thank Antonin at the back there for allowing us to use this salubrious space. We normally hold UCLIC seminars in our other building. You will see people here you may not be familiar with, so please afterwards talk to one another. It's hopefully bringing together different minds from HCI and AI. So it's my great pleasure to introduce James. James I've known for many, many years. And you will see from his bio that he's been in a number of universities in the States, starting off, I think, at CMU, and he's been to Cornell and probably UW. And now he's been at Stanford for a few years. And he's a very well-known professor in human-computer interaction. And for the last few years, he's been the vice director of the Human AI Center at Stanford. And I think it was one of the first to put human before the AI. I'm not going to go through all of the amazing things he's done. I'm just going to say three things about James. One is, I think he's one of the big, deep thinkers in terms of being visionary. Whenever I've seen him, he says, Yvonne, I've got another talk. Have you got 10 minutes? I just want to go through it with you. And there's always this big ideas about how to change the world. And I think this is going to be one of those talks. Another is, James is very popular. He's a great speaker. He once told me that he, on one of his courses in HCI, had 800 students sign up, something like that. And I was just amazed at how you teach that number. And finally, James is great fun to be with. He did spend a couple of years in Beijing, and I happened to be at a conference there. And one night he took us on an amazing tour of the other side of Beijing, including looking at fast boy riders in their very fast cars and other things. But that's for over lunch. So it's my great pleasure to welcome James, who's going to be talking AI for Good Isn't Good Enough, a call for human-centered AI. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that kind introduction. So AI is a powerful tool. We all know this from everything we see out there in our own work, but as well as in the popular culture and press. But I would say it's critical that we design AI systems at what I will term the user, the community, and the society level. And I think if you in this audience start by even just expanding beyond the direct user population to the larger communities your systems might impact, you'll create AI systems that are more likely to have a positive societal impact. So I've been trying to work on this new model of AI design for the last few months. And so today I hope to make these ideas clearer as I speak about the need for a more human-centered artificial intelligence. So just as an introduction, we all know AI is taking the world by storm, from things like scientific discovery with AlphaFold, which may have happened somewhere in one of these buildings. I don't know exactly where DeepMind is around me, but I feel like it must be close. To NLP, who doesn't rely on language translation for anything they do now? And in fact, I was looking at some German restaurants and, just expect it to do the right thing. Or Chat GPT, right? We're looking at foundation models, as we like to call them at Stanford, or large language models that are having profound impact. Or even other industries like fashion. One of my colleagues at Stanford had an interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal in December talking about how the fashion industry is using AI to think about how to optimize supply chain and predict trends and things like this. And we're also seeing AI and robotics. I would say not yet quite social robotics like this, but someday. But the way that most people see AI in their everyday lives is in some ways in manipulating their social network feeds, sometimes to make them feel bad about themselves, or to make them feel angry and be deceived, even upending democracies in the United States or elsewhere in the world. Or we've seen AI helping judges to set bail for accused criminals, or even sentencing in biased ways. So in the United States, there was this system called Compass that was shown to be biased against African Americans in terms of its sentencing. And because of many of these negative uses of AI, we founded the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI almost 4 years ago. And we really had 3 guiding principles that we were focused on. First, we felt that although the deep learning revolution, which some of the folks that I work with at Stanford had helped enable, we felt that deep learning wasn't necessarily going to be the be-all, end-all to intelligent systems. So we wanted to think about what other things are going to need to happen. And so we felt that the human brain is one of the, probably the single most sophisticated device in the known universe, and that we could really learn from that in terms of inspiring future AI algorithms. So this meant we wanted to make sure that we're engaging with neuroscience as well as cognitive science and understanding human behavior. On top of that, this technology has such a high potential for changing society in many different ways, both positive and negative, that we felt it needed to be guided by this concern for human impact. It's too potent for us to just consider the effects after the fact. And instead, we want to make sure we're considering the implications before, during, and after development of AI systems. And then the area that's, I think, closest to the research that I work on, and many of the people here in human-computer interaction, is thinking about that AI should augment and not replace human capabilities. It's inevitable that there's going to be job loss due to AI systems, due to automation. We've seen this before, actually. A lot of the job loss due to globalization that a lot of people think is just offshoring jobs, a lot of that was actually due to automation as well. It's just less of a well-known story. And so we need to think about those issues and be better prepared, I think, than we were for the last trend of this. There is going to be upheaval, but we also think we should have a certain stance in terms of the type of systems that we build, that we are trying to build systems to augment people and help them be better at things that make them human already. So how can I make you a better designer, a better learner, a better healthcare practitioner? Now, because of some of the negative social impacts, we've really seen a proliferation of what I'm going to term just generally AI for good institutes, as well as projects, centers, things like this. And I see those efforts really going in 2 different types of ways from what I've seen out there. The first type of initiative is often made up of social scientists who will notice and critique the potential for real harms of AI. And that's useful, but that doesn't necessarily help us as designers apply AI in positive ways. Like, we want to know, how could we avoid these problems? That might help us avoid some after the fact. We might see something that's going wrong and stop it, but how could we get those things more proactively earlier in the design process? The second type, I think many of these efforts go, is probably more common and often fails. And in this case, it would be when I think technologists decide to go it alone. So what happens often is technologists, AI experts, see an important social impact area like health, and then apply AI naively so that it doesn't actually work in practice. So they get their papers published and things like that, but then when the rubber hits the road and try to use it for real things, it doesn't work out. And this has happened repeatedly and occurred acutely in maybe, quote, short-term crises like COVID, which is not clear to me as short-term, long-term, still going. This one article talked about the hundreds of AI systems created that did not work. But even over the longer term, we've seen this kind of thing. So, for example, in 2016, Turing Award winner Jeff Hinton, this was, I guess, 2 years before he won the Turing Award, he said, "We should stop training radiologists now, as AI will easily surpass humans within 5 years." Okay, so it's been over 5 years. It's not really worked out. Luckily, we kept training radiologists because we actually need them. And so it's not happened in AI in radiology. It's not happened in AI in skin cancer detection, and not AI in several other areas. And often this is due to the differences between the ideal data sets on which researchers often train to test their algorithms and the messiness of the data found in real world hospitals and clinics. That's not to say these things can't happen and they won't happen. They're just happening slower than these people have predicted, because then you have to deal with the real data and the real users and the real people who do things not the way you predicted they would do. Even worse, though, I think, is often these researchers are not solving the right problem. So for example, instead of trying to replace radiologists, we might want to have AI systems working in tandem with the radiologists and make this technology more useful in that way. So augment the radiologist capabilities rather than try to replace them. So my Stanford radiology and AI colleague, Kirk Langholtz, wrote in one of his papers that got quoted in this article in the New York Times, will AI replace radiologists is the wrong question. Instead, he wrote, the right answer is radiologists who use AI will replace radiologists who don't. You can replace radiologists in that sentence, and I think that applies in a lot of other fields. Not every field. There's going to be some things that are either dangerous or real, boring, horrible work that maybe we do want to replace. But in cases like this, we probably want to figure out how to instead augment the person to do better. The big problem, as I see it, is we don't know how to design AI systems to have positive human impacts. And so I believe there's a better way to design AI for positive human impact, and that's what I would term human-centered AI. So how do we get these positive outcomes from AI? Or what would it have taken to have avoided the negative outcomes from that Compass AI-assisted sentencing program? So to avoid these outcomes, I think we need to design and analyze these systems at 3 levels in conjunction. So in terms of the user, the community, and society. And I believe if you do that, you'll create technology that has a better chance of making a positive impact. Okay, so what do I mean by all this human-centered AI and these 3 levels of analysis? What is that? So first, it's about the scope of who we study. Who we study to find our problems, develop our solutions, and evaluate the systems that we build. So to do this, we first need to have a user-centered process. That is, we need to integrate these well-known techniques from human-computer interaction and design that have been around for 30 or 40 years at this point, and really make sure that we're accounting for the needs and the abilities of the end users of computing systems really early and often, and rapidly iterate and improve a design through rigorous testing. You could read the textbook. It's in there, right? We know how to do this, okay? And there's a new edition, I hear. Okay. But we got to go beyond just having good process. We need to creatively develop new designs that augment people by accounting for the cognitive abilities and their existing workflows. And then we need to base those on underlying theories about how and why people behave the way they do. And that's going to help us start to think about developing AI systems that work for those humans who are the users, rather than futilely trying to replicate humans, which has been some of the work so far. If I were to stop right here, you would just say, okay, that's HCN design, you're done. But I think that's not enough. So as has been illustrated by some of the harmful examples I mentioned previously, you can't design just around the end user. That would be like designing that sentencing system just for that judge. And I'd give that judge this great user interface, but that might not deal with the underlying systemic issues in the data that he's using to make those decisions. Underlying bias. So it would ignore the community. It would ignore the community that the accused comes from, maybe their families, their lawyers, their friends. It might ignore the community that the victim, if there's a victim in the crime, comes from. And we need to include those in this analysis. We need to understand the issues that these communities face, including structural barriers they face, for example, racism, before we could properly design that sentencing system. What's more interesting to me, though, is as we start to expand our net of who we're talking to in those communities, some other people might actually, in our view, become users of the system. We might expand thinking, oh, it's not just the judge. These other people need to be able to have access to this system and this data and be able to understand it. And so we might change that other level of analysis by looking at this broader community level of design. I would claim that even that's not enough. We want to understand what are the impacts on society at large. So in the United States, what does it mean to have a large percentage of African-American males in the prison system, or a large percentage of people who are caught using illegal drugs and then they're in jail? These are issues that have immense societal costs. And so we want to be able to forecast what might happen with the software that's going to do sentencing if that software becomes ubiquitous and is used throughout the country. So in fact, that Compass system became used by several states, different counties, et cetera, in the United States. Now, this is all very hard. I'm not saying it's easy, especially though it's especially hard for computer scientists who do not necessarily have the capabilities to think about doing analysis at this level. So because of that, we need true interdisciplinary teams. So not only technologists and AI experts, but we also need experts from design. We need experts from the social sciences and humanities, and we need domain expertise depending on the domain under research. So for example, if we're working in medicine, we're going to need healthcare folks. If we're working in something that had to do with the law or sentencing, we need law experts or environmental science. And these experts have to be true partners on these projects from the start, rather than brought in after the fact to say, hey, do you see any problems? After we built this thing, they have to be members of the design team very early on if we're going to avoid some of these problems. So just to review this model so far, for me, human-centered AI requires we have an interdisciplinary team analyzing the problem at these three levels of user, community, and society simultaneously, or at least very close in time. And then because of those interactions that I talked about, there will probably be people, concepts, and findings that will inform the other levels of analysis. So there's connections between them. They're interdependent. So I want to run you through what this type of analysis might look like for two examples beyond sentencing. The first is from the literature and popular press that I think you'll be familiar with. And then the second one, I'm going to use this to critique one of my own research projects and show where I think we went wrong and how we're improving since we've been able to look at it with this lens. So this here I'm going to talk about is what does human-centered AI analysis look like for autonomous cars. So I've pictured here as a Tesla. Do we have any Tesla drivers here? Okay, very different. When I give this talk in Palo Alto, it's amazing. Okay, so Tesla Model S has this, the plant is like, or the former headquarters until he had a little problem and moved to Texas, is only a couple miles from my house. But this car has this autopilot feature, right? This is, or full self-driving is the formal. You can argue whether we have autonomous cars now or whether it's in the future. It all depends on what your definition of autonomy is. Is it full autonomy? Does it have to happen in all conditions, all weather, all roads, or is it just when certain cases? So that doesn't really matter much. But I would claim that what most researchers have done in this area, both university researchers and industry researchers, so for those who are younger in this room, you may not know, autonomous cars are not a new area. When I was a grad student in the early 90s at Carnegie Mellon, there was this big truck that would drive through the local park with like 20 Sun Micro workstations in the back, and it was, it wasn't going 50 miles an hour, it was more like 5 or 10 miles an hour, but this research has been going on for 40 or 50 years. And what I would claim is that a lot of that research has really looked at the user-centered level, i.e. the driver, and how do we replace the driver? How do we automate out the driver? And I would say that view of only a user-centered level has actually led to some of the issues with this. So we might look at what does the driver see on this large display. That's one of the features of the Tesla, though I just rented one in Denver a couple of weeks ago. The UI is horrible. And you can't use your Apple CarPlay, so forget that. And then behind the steering wheel, we might see a display like this. That is where we might see information when we're in an autonomous driving mode So even when you're not autonomous, it gives you a sense of what other cars the sensors see around you. And so there, we might think about from a user-centered point of view, what do we do when we want to get the user's attention? Because maybe we're less sure about the weather or the recent maps or other cars. That's all what I would call driver level. But these other levels of analysis are also quite important to solving or even posing the correct problem. So at the community level, we might care about other drivers who aren't our users and their behaviors, whether they're in autonomous cars or non-autonomous cars. We care about studying interactions with pedestrians and bicyclists. And in fact, lots of the early problems with these systems have been when exceptions that people didn't expect to happen because they didn't look at it till after they were already deploying the systems occurred. Like, oh, we didn't understand that a person walking a bike across the street would look differently. So they ran that person over and killed them. These have been an afterthought for these efforts, and I would say led to many of these problems. And if we had considered those levels earlier on in the conception of autonomous driving, it might have been different. So some of these are actual accidents, some are just the systems don't behave the way that they do. You may have less experience with this here in London, but let me tell you, in the San Francisco Bay Area and in my area, you see these autonomous cars all the time. In fact, one keeps coming on my street. I'm not sure what it's doing. But what happens is drivers actually behave differently with these autonomous cars than they do with other cars. And their systems don't expect that and then don't behave the way the programmers expected. So again, maybe you could say, oh, we could never have known this without putting them out in the real world. But also I would claim some of the research could have figured this out. But finally, at the society level, we need to consider the impacts of autonomous cars on a city or a region. Maybe the impacts are not as positive as the enthusiasts might lead you to believe. Some studies have shown that autonomous cars will lead to more traffic and more deaths due to driving more miles, living further away, and sending cars around empty. So I'm going to be, I live in Palo Alto. It's like 40 miles to San Francisco. If I have to go up to the city, I'm going to show or something. Oh yeah, I'll go up there, but I'm not going to pay them $60 to park. I'll send my car empty, go park somewhere cheaper and charge or something at the same time, right? That's the behavior that is expected. Or, oh, I don't need to pay $3 million for a house in Palo Alto. I can live 2 hours away and have a house for $500,000, and I can have my autonomous car drive me in while I'm sleeping in the morning in the car or doing some work, and I can feel like I was productive, right? Now I'm driving a lot more miles and there's more traffic accidents related to the number of miles driven. So these aren't just newspaper headlines. There's a newspaper headline, but are based on research. For example, research at the University of Texas, Austin, experts in transportation, who found that at least in the Texas Triangle region, which I'm always like, okay, what is that? Or no, it's called the Texas Triangle mega region. There's a lot of people who live here between Austin, Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. I was like, I expect three cities, not 4. So 2 are on a line somewhere there. That autonomous cars will likely swamp traffic due to the changes that these AI-based cars will cause in people's behavior, okay? If you do the analysis of this. Now, let's see if we can figure out why my clicker's not working. Go to the next slide. Hello, try it there. Okay. With this type of analysis from the start, we might decide that our societal resources might be better spent on building a better public transportation system like you have here, at least in London. But if you come to the United States, almost no city has a great public transport system except New York City. If we only analyze, though, and design at that user-centered level at the start, we're going to ignore many of these important questions until it's too late. And I would claim that at least in the United States, the autonomous car thing is done. Like, the government is committed to changing infrastructure. The companies have committed to this is what their systems will do. Now, there's a question of how much autonomy. There's companies like Toyota who think it's way out versus company like Tesla who think it's already happened. But it's already had a lot of our societal resources pushed onto this bet without really thinking about some of these questions. So I wanted to just recap a little. I wanted to not give you the impression there's no related work in this space. So in the fields of HCI and design, we've been working at this user-centered level for 40 or 50 years, and there's many known techniques. And then there's also great newer work applying these specifically to AI. So for example, this paper by Amershi and colleagues at Microsoft Research and University of Washington is nice, but again, it's really at just the user-centered level. Community-centered design, I think a really well-known technique that could be useful here is value-sensitive design, which was developed by Batya Friedman and David Hendry, which really helps designers find and be explicit about the values of users rather than just the values of the designers. And there's new ideas in this area like design justice by Kostanas Chok. And then finally at the society center level, I think there's less well-known techniques on how to design for this, but there's good recent work pointing out at least what some of the problems are. So for example, Safia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, there's several other books kind of like that. I think for us as researchers, though, one of the key questions is how do we integrate these kind of ideas across into a coherent design process that practitioners could actually use to design AI systems? And I think that's where some of the future research for this talk should go. So now that I've given you an idea of what human-centered AI is, I'd like to take you through one of my own research projects that uses AI and show you where it's human-centered and also where we can do a lot better. This human-centered AI lens that I just presented to you is changing this project for the better, in my opinion, after some early missteps. So the motivation of this project, called the Hybrid Physical Digital Spaces Project, was to react to many of the problems that Americans face in terms of people being overstressed, inactive, wasteful, uninspired, and feeling isolated or not belonging in their home or work. And we observed that many people, or that people spend much of their time inside the built environment with these inflictions. So according to the US EPA, Americans spend 87% of their time in buildings. Okay, makes sense. You know, you're either at work or you're at home, or you're in your car. That's the other like 7% of that on top of that. So we wanted to understand on this project, how do different features of the built environment, such as the materials, like this kind of fake white laminate stuff versus natural wood, or access to light, or being able to see nature, as well as the user experience, for example, noise, or dynamic digital displays, how do those things affect our health and well-being? And so we ran experiments showing connections between those different factors and people's well-being on different measures, for example, stress. And we want to show how we can sense this as well as potentially nudge it in positive ways. So I'm going to give you just a view of some of the experiments and visions that we have very briefly. But there's this growing awareness that our time spent in buildings can negatively impact our wellness. But the science behind this awareness and the recommended strategies to improve the situation are quite thin. So this kind of surprised me when I started this project with one of my colleagues at Stanford. I thought the architects and the civil engineers, she's a civil engineer, would have done the studies to be able to tell you how different aspects of the built environment affect you. They haven't actually. There's not a lot of good studies, and the ones that are very short-term and limited. And so we were interested in how do we build up a science to understand how buildings affect people, and then how could we redesign spaces to account for these understandings, and then how do we design systems that can sense our afflictions and dynamically adjust spaces to help improve our health and wellness. So that's where we start to get into the AI part of this project. So we did the first thing right. We started with this strong interdisciplinary team that includes expertise in buildings and architecture, computing, including HCI, security, and AI, and experts in people, including psychology, health, privacy, and law, education, and organizational behavior, and all had a passion for how could we create a better built environment? Now, we were not using this human-centered AI lens when we started this project, given that I just really have been developing it over the last 6 months. But I'll also admit that as an HCI person, I was really focused on that user-centered level, because that's what we do, and that's what we've been teaching for years, and that's where I was focused. But I'm going to use the lens now, and I'm going to go through pieces to show you where the gaps might be. So we did base our initial ideas on a model that illustrates how building features, individual outcomes, and organizational outcomes and societal outcomes are all linked. In fact, this slide was from our initial pitch to get funding from an internal grant source. So we were thinking about that at the beginning. So by building features, I mean things like the noise or light or the materials or your access to nature. And if these are negative, like in the example there, they can lead to bad individual outcomes. So things listed here like stress, anxiety, distraction, that's sort of at that user-centered level and those impacts. And then these in turn lead to organizational or community outcomes, such as lack of productivity, waste, and a sense or a lack of belonging. That's more of community-centered. And then finally, those outcomes have impact at a societal level on things like the economy or our environment or our general health and well-being. So at least we were kind of thinking, even though I didn't have those terms, that those annotations at the top were not on the original slides. But we were thinking that from the start. But I'd say we really were focused over here in the actual research that we carried out. So just to give you an idea of what the original vision was, we created a vision video. I'm not going to show the video, but the original vision video had these scenes. For example, we have here a worker whom we might detect the stress. And so we might adapt their space to have more natural scenery, or we might lower the lights and change the music to reduce their stress. And from an HCI design perspective, it was all like, how do I do that in a non-creepy way? So, like James is playing cool jazz again. He must be stressed out. How do I do that? Or we might have these dynamic ambient murals in public spaces or on personal devices. So imagine this wall display in the hall, because there's going to be all these cheap displays where these petals are blowing down the wall this way, which just encourages me to walk that way. I want to go, where are these petals going? What's going on? That's where the stairs are and the elevator's that way. Or that's where that new person, Maria, who I haven't met yet in the group, sits that way. And so I might run into them more likely. These are different ways that the environment, we might dynamically adapt it in ways to affect people's behavior. So that's a vision for the future where buildings and people interact in a way and it positively shapes our well-being. But I'll admit it's a very techno-optimist future. So hold that for a little bit. But how would we even get to that future? So there's actually this nascent well-building movement. Is very similar to the earlier environmental building movement that's exemplified by LEED certification. So you'll say, this building's LEED platinum or something, meaning, they save on energy and water and things like this. So what's been done in that field so far? Almost all the studies we found behind the well-building movement are really small scale. They've generally been short-term. The most common one is you have a group that's working in a certain building and you just give them a whole bunch of surveys, and then they move to another building 6 weeks later. And then after a couple of months, you give them the surveys again and you see if you see some difference. That tends to be the kind of work. Or there's stuff where we try to manipulate stuff and maybe you're in one condition for 1 week and another condition for another week. That's actually some of the gold standard ones, like for example, with CO2. Once you read the CO2 study, you want to leave your windows open, by the way. Yeah, so you'll want to make sure you got openable windows, but we had to fight for in our new building that we're building. So they're generally based on self-report. They're these simple survey studies, and that's the extent actually of most of the research, which was very surprising to me. We're trying to take a more integrated and scientific approach. So our first step is try to establish the science and understand how building attributes can impact occupant states and naturalistic settings over long periods. And then we also want to design adaptations, including dynamic ones that can support well-being. But before we create and deploy any of these, we need to understand what type of sensing and data collection people are willing to work with and which they prefer not to have. And so I'm going to discuss these things briefly. So after some preliminary online experiments where we had people see pictures of office spaces that they were to imagine moving into, and we got some really good results that surprised me, we actually did a year-long controlled lab experiment with over 400 people. So in this experiment, we systematically varied building features such as natural or artificial materials, natural or artificial light. So you can see we had these two identical offices. We actually paid someone to build a wall across the windows there. And then we moved the furniture around a lot. And one of our grad students, she's really good at moving furniture at this point. And we varied these images that are here on the wall to show diversity or not. So in one condition, there are a bunch of white guys. In another condition, it was people of multiple races and genders. We had participants wear an Empatica watch to get electrodermal activity, or EDA, which is a measure of stress. We had an Apple Watch. We measured creativity. And then, of course, we had to stress them out because this was a lab study. They were only in there about an hour. So we asked people, in the middle of this, you're going to have to give a talk in 2 minutes about your positive and negative personality characteristics, which you'll see in a second really stresses people out. And so let's see if I can go to this next slide here. So you can see here on self-report, the natural materials, and I'm only showing the biggest results. You can see the journal paper for all of them. The natural materials help decrease the stress in participants. Here is in self-reported, but you also see this with the EDA, the electrodermal activity here on the right. And so you can see the natural material condition, people didn't get as stressed and they kind of recovered quickly. And essentially this is us saying, hey, you're going to have to give this talk in 2 minutes, and it goes up. Participants who were exposed to the windows also had lower negative stress impacts, just not as large of an impact as the natural furniture, which I wouldn't have predicted that's what was going to be the biggest. There's also belonging and other creativity impacts that you'll see in the paper. Now, as we want to run these experiments beyond the lab, we want to run these in more naturalistic situations over longer periods, we need to have more sophisticated measures or methods to measure outcomes more automatically. We can't have people filling out standard psychological surveys all the time while they're at work. So we're interested in improving these 5 measures. So stress, belonging, creativity, physical activity, and environmental behavior. We're intentional not to explore productivity, as it is actually one of the areas that has been explored more, but also because it introduces serious concerns of management and misuse. So think about Amazon warehouse workers who, if they don't fill enough boxes, they're fired. So how are we going to do this? So first, we want to use machine learning AI to triangulate using 3 types of sensors to infer these outcomes. So we start with self-report, which I just criticized to you a moment ago, though we use a particular kind of self-report. So we use experience sampling method, where we might send somebody a questionnaire of just one question. Let's say, how stressed are you on a scale of 1 to 10, 4 times a day, or something like this. They might be able to answer it in seconds on their watch or phone. We can also use all those building sensors that have been put into buildings for sustainability and security purposes, which lets us know, for example, how many people in a room, or the energy use and how much recycling has occurred. And then finally, much of our data is going to leverage people's personal sensors that they're carrying. So everyone's, wearing watches or carrying phones or laptops. These are sophisticated sensing devices that let us get at physical activity and stress through physiological sensing. Now, because that type of data is highly personal and sensitive, from the beginning of the project, we cared about privacy. And we knew we had to have non-technical and technical approaches to this. Privacy has been part of the research agenda, as I said, from the beginning. We assess people's comfort level with collecting the data with surveys, focus groups. We have ways we explore for people to express their privacy preferences to the building. All the studies are opt-in, and we have ways for people to view and delete their data. And then finally, you need to secure it on a need-to-know basis. But as I thought about this, it felt like that was all just user-centered design about privacy. There might be a little bit of community like the opt-in, but we felt something was missing. So if we think about the features that I've shown and what levels we were designing at the user-centered level, we're mainly thinking about things like, encouraging exercise or other things that were features for the individuals. Even keeping their data, it's about that individuals. At the community-centered level, we thought just a little bit about, what does it mean for someone to come in the building who's not part of our experiment or hasn't opted in? Like, this person's delivering something. What does that mean? We thought about that a little, but not too much. And then at the society level, we weren't really thinking much at all. I mentioned the economy earlier, but that was just kind of like hand wavy, the kind of thing you write in a proposal to say, hey, if we do these things, it's going to affect the economy, or public health, but we didn't really have much analysis there. And so we wanted to think about how might we get at these community-centered and society-centered issues. And that's where I really felt there was a problem with this project. So now I'm going to show you some of the newer research that I feel has come about because of this different lens of thinking about this at a higher level. So this uneasiness with privacy implications at these community and society level led us to develop and run several design workshops. And this is a participatory technique. That's not new. What's new, I think, is how we structured them. So the workshops have really helped us do more of this community-based analysis, I would say, more than the society level that we've been missing. So we have these workshop participants essentially through a structured card game. They pose benefits and risks, and then they work through these value trade-offs themselves as teams, and then suggest potential interventions for how you might solve this. Now, what's different than this from other techniques is we don't just come in as designers and say, tell us what the problems are, and then we go and we solve the value problems, and then we design for it. We actually have them trying to resolve the value tensions and actually pose design interventions, and I'll show you at what level they are. We've now run the workshop with over 100 participants, 6 different iterations, and I'd say it's been successful, but it's still early work for me to claim this is the right way forward. So one of the big issues in these smart spaces is how do we communicate to individual users and the community about what's happening in the smart space? So what data is being tracked and how is it being used? And what recourse do you have to change that is how it's being used with respect to you? So a big part of our workshop was focused on how to communicate these issues to people who use these hybrid digital spaces. So one way that products communicate these issues today is with privacy policies. But these privacy policies are essentially useless. So at left is an art piece where the artist has printed out the real privacy policies from products that you use every day. Nobody reads these. How many people here read the privacy policies? Anybody? Usually there's 1 or 2 in the crowd. See, we got somebody, but most people don't read these, okay? And it's because these are purely a legal construct. These are to protect the companies that write them from lawsuits. They aren't meant to really communicate to you what's really going on with the product. So instead, we were looking for another way to how do we communicate what's going on in a building? Like, there is some sensing and stuff going on here. I don't know what it is. Like, it's not really communicated to me. So we've been developing this idea of implication design, and that's where we try to embed a product's ethical implications directly into its design. So for example, this is one not from us, this is from an artist called the eye cam. Here, this is a webcam shaped like a creepy human eye. You really know it's watching you when it's moving like this. That's a form of communication. It's trying to tell you what's going on. It's not ambiguous. There's some examples of this in the market today, like, your phone has a little green dot or something when it's recording or something like that. But most of those things don't truly communicate the extent of the threat. Here's another example. This is called the parasite. I don't know if you've seen this. This is from other designers. You put this on top of your smart speaker, and it only unlocks when you give the keyword that you've defined. So you're sure that Google, Amazon, or Apple are not listening into your conversations. And so it's protecting you, and it communicates to you. So our goal was, like, how do we think about combining communication and protection in design. And this is what we call implication design. So what does a workshop look like? So a key idea is that the participants in our workshops are diverse in terms of their domain knowledge. So we want people who have some expertise, like technologists, designer, or policy, or other domain experts, but they're also diverse in terms of their lived experience. So we didn't want just experts, but just a variety of people. And in fact, in some early workshops, we had different people with different lived experiences that affected what the outcomes were. For example, there was a trans participant who really was able to bring up issues that was from their experience that would have been lost if it was the experts who didn't have that lived experience. So while that expertise alone can provide a more nuanced understanding of potential harms and benefits, you can end up with blind spots that fail to consider harms related to social and identity-based characteristics. So this workshop's meant to be lightweight and easy for everyone to participate. And it has 3 key rounds that are structured by using a deck of cards. So in the anticipation round, participants fill out a deck of cards by speculating on hypothetical situations, including impacted users. So who are the roles that are going to be there? And then positive and negative implications, because I mean, if we're looking at technology, we want to know what it's good for as well. And then that's followed by what we call an implication design round, where the participants prototype potential designs for communicating or mediating the implications of the anticipated threats. And then finally, in an action round, the groups use these finished card decks and try to play a role-playing game where they try to raise a potential threat, and then a paired team tries to use a design artifact to counter the threats. And part of the design of the workshop has changed over time. So originally it was really an adversarial game at this point, and we found that participants just didn't like that. So now it's much more of a collaborative game. But one of the keys of getting down to better results than I think you would get with just normal workshop format is how these teams kind of push each other to consider things they weren't thinking. And so that pairing of teams has, we found, worked really well for this. So here's some of the many artifacts that have come out of the workshop. At left is an uncertainty communicator. So the idea here was to surface how uncertain a system was about an inference. Or at center is an anonymity bracelet. So it anonymizes any of the wearer's collected information. Now, if you're not a designer, you might think, God, those don't really seem like products. Those aren't necessarily products. They're what I might term experience prototypes. So they're meant to spark further design. And that's the kind of thing that would come out of the workshop. But now you're going to have designers kind of take these things and say, okay, what might this spark further? So again, at this point in time, I don't think we've done enough of this. We've explored this with the community in a real space, but we really need to get into more spaces and then take these to the next level. So if I use this human-centered AI analysis at all 3 levels for this project, HPDS, it might look something like this. So at the user-centered level, we work with and design with building residents, the companies that lease the space, the building managers, and even building owners. At the community-centered level, we should also work with anyone who might come into the building or even the neighbors of the building. And then at the society-centered level, we need to analyze how the system might impact many different groups, but in particular, people with disabilities or other marginalized identities that may not wish to disclose. And this might happen at the community or the society level. But I think what's interesting is when I look at this, is it raises questions of privilege in society. So who has access to these fancy health-shaping buildings and who does not? And what happens if these buildings are used for workplace surveillance? So far, I think we've mainly focused at these lower levels of analysis, and we're trying to kind of move up. I think the questions that I raise here at the society-centered level imply that that we need to analyze questions of power, which is often left out of technology research. If the decision makers decide to prioritize the user-centered design for managers over the community-centered design for the workers, then you get a surveillance state building is going to result. And so we want to actively design to avoid this. And so just as a last slide, this recognition of power reminds me of this great talk I saw last fall by Ibram X. Kendi, the well-known author and MacArthur Award winner. So I was at the Rhode Island School of Design, and he was giving this talk, and president of the Rhode Island School of Design, Crystal Williams, asked him, what can artists and designers do in creating an anti-racist society? And he replied, what is missing is an analysis of power, bring an understanding to people about power. We live in a moment when different identity groups are advocating for their rights, their power, their presence, and pushing back against ways they've been degraded. What is missing is the bridges of solidarity. We need to constantly be building those bridges. Historically, you know who's built those bridges? Artists and designers. So I believe as designers, we need to take on this analysis of design at the three levels I've advocated: user, community, and society, so we can properly identify and take on power, so we can build those bridges of solidarity. And I would claim there's a lot of power happening right now with AI systems and companies that control it. They have the power. They're making decisions for society without us being involved in it, and we need to be able to take that back. So what I want to take away from this introduction is that there's many great applications where we can use AI to help people be better at their tasks, to augment them to be better learners, better designers, or take better care of their body. That's one of our principles. But I think the key is to keep users, communities, and society's needs at the center of these smart interface designs. It's critical to design at these three levels. I think we're in the really early days of finding the right design processes to practice truly human-centered AI. But I think you can just start with just getting to communities beyond your direct users, and you will already make a positive impact. Thank you.
We're streaming this and recording it. So if you would like to ask a question, you need to just hold this thing in front of your mouth. And if you have privacy issues, then let us know. Enrico.
Thank you. Very, very inspiring talk. I'm still digesting it, but one question that comes to mind is your framework touches upon this question of society, but it doesn't seem to foreground the role of the designer in a way that is like taking into account what is this designer trying to push, who is paying for the design, why, and so on. What comes to mind, and I've used this reference in other talks, there is a beautifully shot kind of documentary entertainment piece by a British director called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, Adam Curtis, which kind of talks about how companies kind of hide behind technology to actually just pursue their financial interest, and then say it's the computer that is deciding this. Is there one more level about to take into account sort of the designer position?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. So one thing I would mention that is maybe orthogonal to this is just, I don't see this way of analyzing these three levels as a silver bullet to avoid all problems. If you still have a management who's paying for your work and their answer to every question is, does that make us more money or does that, then bad things happen. We already see this with Facebook, with they had teams that repeatedly tell them this is bad, but that thing makes more money, and Mark Zuckerberg or whoever he's enforced to make those decisions have always gone the wrong way. So having a good process won't deal with some things. But I do think a designer, well, first of all, even a designer is probably even the wrong term in this, because this is a team sport. So I would say designers need to be working together at these different levels. And I think at the higher levels, they can get at some of those issues. But if there's the people paying for it or the management doesn't buy in, then bad things can still occur. And so we need things like this. Well, we also need laws and regulation. We need processes. And then we also need other kinds of ethics reviews. And we have one at Stanford that's pretty unique, but I didn't have time to talk about. I think hitting on all those levels and education for the people who are building these things will help. But we need to hit it from these different angles or bad things still occur.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for coming and thanks for the great talk. Really, really inspiring. Although human-centered AI sounds like a bit of an oxymoron. So models keep getting bigger and developing more capabilities, and these capabilities are surprising us. I think it's fair to say that academics haven't just been humbled by the results of simply scaling AI. They've been humiliated by how trivial it is to emulate human-like behavior with internet data and a couple of A100 GPUs. As universities struggle to find their role in the AI's arms race, it's very clear to me, I agree with you completely, that we have to transition away from the traditional genres of academic research, like computer graphics and machine learning. And instead, we have to start leveraging the enormous diversity offered by universities, as this is underused capability that myopically focused companies like Meta or OpenAI simply do not have. What was your process at Stanford for encouraging interdisciplinary research? How would you evaluate your own performance with respect to your peers who are working in traditional genres? And as a depressed academic who cannot compete with big labs, can you suggest something for me to work on? Thank you.
That's a great question. And it's got several questions packed into it. So one is, when we started this institute, it was really 3 co-founders who were like, we got to do this thing because we saw where AI was going. 2 of those people are famous AI folks. So Chris Manning, who's one of the most famous people in NLP, and Fei-Fei Li, who made ImageNet, which kind of led to kind of deep learning being able to show that it worked. I was the human-centered person and insisted that we keep that term in front of this AI because that would guide us. And I feel in some ways I failed because all we had the term, I didn't feel like necessarily the research kind of followed until I was like, I got to think about this, and started to write this talk. Now, we did develop it at Stanford for some of the reasons I think you got at, which was we have really strong law, humanities, social sciences, as well as strong computer science and engineering. And we felt to guide this field, we needed all those things coming together. So it was meant to cross the campus from the beginning. Now, it's very easy to say, oh, you have those people. Now, how do you get them working together? So I'm also, my role as the vice director, I'm also the director of research, which means I get to dole out the money. You know, we have a review process, but we literally are giving out somewhere around $6 million per year to researchers at Stanford in this area. And the way I have that thing set up is it's biased towards interdisciplinary teams rather than solo PI things. You know, there's occasionally a thing where like, oh, this is a core underlying technology thing, and it may just, you know, have an AI person and a neuroscience. But then there's a lot, especially bigger projects, where we really have to have people from these different areas. So a lot of the money and other things that we do in HAI are trying to leverage that. And that is also, like you said, what I think the university brings that these companies don't have. They might have a group with some of those people. But I saw an article, I think it was in the Financial Times just the other day, showing that, you know, in terms of like AI ethicists or people for AI safety, DeepMind was like the best at like 3%, and you know, Meta and others like 1%. So there's just not the diversity of those people, and they tend not to be integrated into teams. And so part of me trying to develop this process is then for us to apply it on some of the large projects that we're doing and try to show where does it work, where does it fail, where do we not know what the hell we're doing, and we need to do more research. But the whole idea is I want to get to a point where we have a replicable design process that I could teach to industry people, or I could teach to my class of, the biggest has been 250, not 800, but whatever. I could teach them my 250 Stanford undergrads, and they could go out into industry and you know, apply it. That's kind of the goal for me. But those are all, you know, really great questions. Now, in terms of the depression part, Fei-Fei is constantly sending me text messages as an AI person. You know, I think it's more depressing for them than us. Like as an HCI person, it's like, oh, this shit finally works. So I can actually use it in stuff I've been building, because I've been building things based on AI for 30 years, but now it works, versus, oh, it's going to work soon. for the students in that area, it's gotten depressing because they feel I can't do anything unless I'm building a large model that only these few companies have the resources to build. Now, Demis, of DeepMind was just at dinner with us 2 nights ago, and he was saying, yeah, the big models may win, but he's still not convinced, and he has kind of 50% of his research cycles going to all of the other things that you're going to need. And so one thing university researchers could say is, well, I'm just not gonna, I can't compete on that, so I'm going to work on all these other things. That's one thing. The alpaca work recently at Stanford showed, oh, even if you had somebody's big base model, you could still do some interesting stuff on top of it. So I think it's early days to determine whether AI PhDs are a dead end right now. I think we've been in similar positions in the past. For example, there was a point where university departments weren't hiring computer architects anymore. As Johan said, I've been in many departments. I usually like to say I move one step ahead of the law, but none of those departments were hiring architects because Intel was just could throw thousands of great engineers and process technology, and the fabs cost billions of dollars, starting to sound like large language models. And so nobody could compete, but then they ran into the wall. They ran into the wall of power and heat. And then suddenly academic research actually started to show up again in architecture. Now, it's possible that just we're going to throw more data at large models and nothing else is going to matter. I'm going to bet the opposite. I'm going to bet it gets really good, but then there's more capabilities you want and it just can't do it anymore. And then I think they're already starting to see some asymptote happening. And I think that's when new ideas are going to be valued. So I do think it can be a little depressing for some of the AI students right now to feel like, well, how can I compete with this? But I think you have to have a long view and see what's happened in prior technology things in the past. I'm not saying that's right. Fei thinks I'm wrong, but.
Thank you. Just to say that we've had 40 people online as well for the whole talk. So and I'm going to combine a couple of questions from different people here. The first one is you talk about digital harms. What's your understanding of digital good here in this area? And then a related one kind of sits around, is there a need for the HCI community to have a political manifesto that ties values with potential policy guidelines?
Interesting. So in terms of the goods, I mean, I feel like the goods are like all over the place. Like most people who, not everyone, but a lot of HCI research is techno-optimist. Like, oh, we could do this thing and it'll be great. So there's lots of examples of goods, whether it's in health, education, any of the kind of important areas that you might think about. I could write all kinds of papers about all the goods. I think that's easy. Showing that they actually work in real life, that's the hard part. Now, in terms of the political manifesto, wow, that's interesting. I mean, I do think it won't make sense for HCI researchers to just do something on their own because they're not in the powerful position at this point. I think the key is getting AI researchers who are now seeing these things aren't just things we worked on in the lab for many years, that they're really having the impact on society. And I think a lot of AI researchers have come to go, oh, wait, I actually have to think about these things because this is powerful. I think a lot of AI researchers are coming to that. So I think in terms of coalitions with AI and, creating centers like this where it's AI plus these other fields is the way to move forward. I don't think one field going, hey, you must do this, listen to us, we know better, that never works. So that's what I would say to a manifesto.
We have maybe 2 more questions, and then I think I can hear some stomachs rumbling. And is there some lunch outside? Yeah. So we'll start with you, or we'll start with you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the amazing talk. In one of the study, you mentioned that you study people's self-report of their experience in the building environment, and then you moved from laboratory settings to in the wild naturalistic settings.
Yeah.
I want to ask your thoughts about how to design AI what's the challenge in designing the AI in these naturalistic settings, and how far can this AI go?
So in that naturalistic setting, so one is, can you even get the kind of data, like some of this data is like on certain one of these things we care about, can you even get data on it? So for example, creativity, how do I measure that? Like, I'm not even sure how to do that. Right now, there's a bunch of these standard creativity tasks, like, we give you some materials and ask you to come up with all the ideas you might use it. But how do I get that automatically? That one's kind of hard, right? On the other hand, stress seems easy, but even there, the research is kind of mixed at how well heart rate variability or EDA predicts actual stress. So, some of it is just like, do we have good signals, let alone the AI algorithms and enough data, et cetera? Do we even have good signal to know? So, that's really the next stage for a lot of this work is, what can you actually detect, and is it good enough? And maybe you have to have some self-report on certain things. You will never be able to get it fully automatically. So many of these things I think are likely to be hybrid kind of systems, where some of it is actually self-report. And then it becomes a design question of, how do I design to have you do self-reports in a way that doesn't feel onerous, but feels more like it's part of the application that you wanted to use in the first place? And in fact, sometimes having a little self-report may cause you to be more engaged in, for example, behavior change we found, than if it was purely automatic tracking of your exercise activities. So, there's a lot of design that will go into how do you apply the AI in these situations. The other big thing that we're doing is, that I didn't talk about this, is a lot of health situations. So for example, imagine those kind of smart buildings for elder care. Okay, then there's a lot of issues of, what kind of sensors? If I want to know that mom's brushing her teeth or bathing properly, do I really want a camera in her bathroom? Camera's actually probably the best sensor right now. Computer vision really works a lot better than many other sensors, but then there's a lot of privacy issues. So what's the trade-off? Might you use Wi-Fi radar sensing in spaces that are more private, and use cameras in more like public, like the living room? So trying to just figure out what's the right sensors to deploy in different situations. Again, the workshop methodology is a way for us to kind of get at that. And we're doing a lot of work in that healthcare space with that as well.
Great. Thank you again for the talk.
Sure.
This kind of comes from a discussion that some students and I were having while over lunch yesterday. We were talking about, from the model's perspective, so one step, I guess, inside of a system, whether models and how they were created or designed should be open sourced or not, or whether they should be just publicly available as in the knowledge of them, because we were talking about ChatGPT-4, where you don't really know what the difference is between ChatGPT-4 and GPT-3. Do you have a stance on that? It's a little bit related, just because when you're talking about systems, it's hard to define a tool without making it either a good tool or a bad tool.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I have a stance, but it's not a stance that I would hold my body up too hard with. I mean, I do feel like part of the problem right now is that these things are controlled by private companies who choose not to disclose them for proprietary reasons. Now, there might be some middle grounds where we could pass laws that say they have to tell us, for example, what are the exact data sets that were used to create it, or something like this, that we then might be able to infer more about what's going on there. I don't actually know what the right answer is, but I feel like there has to be some amount of disclosure of these things, so that or independent audits, so that we can understand what the risks are, what the trade-offs are. There's a lot of research on auditing tools. I have a student who's done some work there as well. I think as long as these things, though, are controlled just by private corporations, and something like OpenAI, it's not even a public company, so there's even less regulation on what they do, is kind of a dangerous situation. There's been less danger so far because this is like people are just playing with them, but now people are going to start building real things on them. Like they're going to build some health thing, they're going to some all kinds of things that can have negative impacts if done wrong. And so I do think we're going to need regulation. Now the question is it stuff like the European Union's proposed rules? It's clear they're already outdated, within 1 year. And so trying to figure out what that right level is interesting. Now, I'm no expert in this. This is why I would say my stance wasn't hard, but we have policy people at HAI. We also have a woman, Marjorie, who was, she was a member of the European Parliament, and she's now like the advisor to one of the main people doing the regulation. So we have a lot of people in the mix who kind of have more expertise on that, and people are grappling with what the right answer is. I don't know what the right answer is, but I think we need to do more than what we're doing now, is what I'd say.
Okay, one very last question, because you keep looking very keen there.
Hi, James. Thank you very much for the talk. I really thought that 3-layered framework or a strategy to attack this big problem is really useful. So I had some experience previously in my PhD, actually. So I was working on this big European funded project from Horizon 2020, in which we were designing AI tools for musicians and artists. So like looking more at the first level in your framework, user-centered design, and designing for technologists that make products out of these tools. And we tried in this big longitudinal study, use these user-centered design techniques like ideation cards, as you're using, trying to distill implications for design as well. And we had these creative workshops where people they were stimulated to produce creative outcomes, new applications. And one of the things that we've always hit was a limitation in terms of literacy of AI techniques. So eventually people, to be able to understand and to have like a critical understanding of what they're dealing with, they do need to have some level of understanding of what's the underlying technology.
Yeah.
So for instance, to understand how a probabilistic model is successful in certain situations or fails in another ones, it implies understanding some of the statistics or the hidden Markov models that were programmed there. And so one of our approaches was to try to design or try to achieve a nice trade-off between a top-down teaching approach and a bottom-up learning approach would allow for creativity to flourish. So I was trying to understand how literacy is accounted for in your framework, and what are the tensions that you can see that might happen between the 3 levels, for instance.
That's a really good question. So in those workshops, one is you have this purposeful variety of backgrounds. There will be some people with that technical literacy, but then we didn't want those people to dominate conversation. So there's a lot about the structure to kind of cause that not to happen. So some of the people that might have knowledge that they can help others, but then there is some basic educational stuff in there about kind of what the sensors and what the AI might be able to do, but probably not even at the level that you just described, like very high level, because some people don't even know that. And so there is a question of, is it enough for the problems? It hasn't come up as a problem in the ones that we've done so far, but it's probably an interesting one that I will highlight to my graduate students and postdocs who are doing the next set of them, to go, is there a problem there? We've written a paper on it. It wasn't one of the things that popped out, but you never know. And it may be that they're not pushing deep enough for those questions to be what's there. I mean, more of the problems we ran into were people just making real shortcuts that the solution's always, we got to pass a law about that. Policy regulation is the solution, rather than, oh, there's some other way that we might be able to limit the negative impacts. And so we actually had to add structure, originally banning, saying, oh, create a law. Then we determined, no, you can't really do that. but creating a structure that lets people go beyond just saying create policy or create laws, to think about design interventions that might be able to do something. But in terms of the technical knowledge, it hasn't been a problem yet, but it may be that our domains were narrow enough that people understood what the possibilities were. You know, they understood like face recognition and things like this without getting too detailed.
If people are not informed well enough, how can they develop well supported development?
Well, I'm not sure that the values necessarily have to be based on what the technology can do versus what are the values that we hold as people in society, right? Now, knowing what's like, knowing, for example, that face recognition might pick the wrong person and cause somebody to get arrested who shouldn't get arrested. Knowing that might cause you to bring up a value, but you might already have that value. And so the question is there a way to get that value to be raised without knowing all of the technical ins and outs? And that I'm not sure we know yet, but I see where you're going there.
Okay, before we thank James, just to say that we have a buffet lunch outside, and James is going to be around all afternoon. So there are some people who booked to see him, but if you would like to have a chat, I think it's just going to be in the
yeah, if anybody wants to chat after the currently scheduled ones, I'm here till at least 5 or 5:30 and glad to chat with people.
Yeah, and those of you,
Please keep me awake. I only slept 2 hours on the plane, so.
and those of you who are going to Hamburg to the Chi conference, James will be there. I'm sure he will be happy to continue discussion over a few beers. But let's thanks
At
James
least a
again
few.
for a great talk.
Thank you.